I only have about 20 minutes to talk, so if you'd like to find out more about my work or read some of my articles, you can visit my website, turningpointproject.com, not to be confused with that imposter outfit, Turning Point USA. So I'm turningpointproject.com. Dr. Goldberg and I are both doctors, but not the kind that can help you in an emergency, so if our talks send you into shock, you're out of luck. Carl's talk will be about the threat from Islam, and my talk will be about the threat from the Catholic Church. Seriously, my topic is how to get the Church to join the resistance in the fight against Islam. Now, some of the non-Catholic members of the audience may wonder what the Catholic Church has to offer in the fight against Islam. Well, one thing it has to offer is numbers. There are approximately 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, but only about 16 million Jews. Those aren't very good odds. However, there are about 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide. Potentially, the Catholic Church is a powerful center of resistance to Islam. It certainly has been in the past. Unfortunately, that's not the case today. What are those 1.3 billion Catholics doing in regard to the struggle with Islam? Well, essentially very little. Many of them are just standing on the sidelines. Why is that? Well, the chief reason is that they're getting little guidance about Islam from Catholic leaders. For example, the Catechism of the Catholic Church devotes only 44 words to the subject of Islam, which is about 80 words less than the warning label on a bottle of Tylenol. Except that there is no warning, only a bland reassurance that, together with us, Muslims adore the one merciful God. That's about all that it says in the Catechism. Unfortunately, that has been interpreted by a good many Catholics to mean, go back to sleep and don't worry about a thing. It's just a tiny handful of extremists out there. The majority of Muslims are peaceful because it's a peaceful religion. But it's not just that many Catholics have been lulled into complacency about Islam. The sad fact is that many in the church leadership have become enablers of Islam. Excuse me. I'll give some examples of that shortly, but first let me make the point that not all Catholics have lost their senses. Take Carlo Liberati, the Archbishop of Pompeii, who recently warned that Europe will soon be Muslim because of our stupidity. Well, he should know because bad things have happened in Pompeii, and it could happen again. Or take Jesuit Father Henri Boulade, who criticized the Pope's policy of welcoming Muslim migrants by saying, "The Catholic Church has fallen into the trap of the liberal left ideology which is destroying the West. You," he wrote to the Pope, "you go from concession to concession and compromise to compromise at the expense of the truth." So, not everyone in the church is asleep. Here's one more example. Last month, an estimated 1.5 million Polish Catholics gathered along Poland's borders to take part in an event called the Rosary at the Borders. Significantly, the event took place on October 7th, the anniversary of the Battle of Lepanto, one of the largest naval battles ever fought. Under the leadership of the Holy League, which had been organized by Pope Pius V, the Catholic fleet destroyed the much larger Ottoman fleet and saved Europe from an Islamic invasion. Pope Pius credited the victory to Mary's intercession and established October 7th as the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, sometimes called Our Lady of Victory. Some Catholics know their history. The Poles know that Muslims have tried to invade Europe on numerous occasions, and the Poles are determined that it's not going to happen on their watch. Having said that, it must be admitted that many Catholics are asleep to the threat. And that goes double for the Catholic leadership. It's not an exaggeration to say that many in the leadership have become enablers of Islam. By encouraging mass Muslim migration, by peddling a rose-colored view of Islam, and by supporting Islam at every turn, Catholic leaders are aiding and abetting the spread of an aggressively anti-Christian and anti-Semitic belief system. Catholic leaders are forever assuring us that violence has nothing to do with Islam, that terrorists pervert their faith, and that, to paraphrase Pope Francis, if we speak of Muslim violence, we must speak of Catholic violence also, because it's moral equivalence there. Well, Muslims are bad sometimes, but Catholics are real bad sometimes, so it all washes out. Meanwhile, other Catholic authorities tell us that we must declare our solidarity with Islam, but never explain why Catholics should want to profess solidarity with a religion that executes apostates, stones adulterers, and cuts off the hands of thieves. Meanwhile, Catholic universities have become apologists for Islam. The prime example is Georgetown's Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, also known as the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. It's called that because most of the center's funding comes from a Saudi prince, which may explain why the center's chief focus is on fighting that greatest of all evils, Islamophobia. That's pretty much what they do at the center. They study Islamophobia and preach against it. Al-Walid bin Talal, he's in jail now, isn't he? But in the Ritz-Carlton, that's not a bad place to... Hopefully the people at Georgetown will join him there soon at the Riyadh County Jail. Other Catholic colleges give their students the impression that the Arabs created civilization, and still others celebrate International Hijab Day in order to all together now show their solidarity with Islam. Let me put it this way: if you graduated from a Catholic college, you can be almost certain that your alma mater is, in one way or the other, helping Islam to win the culture war. And then there's the bishop's response to mass Muslim migration into Europe. It's no secret that the bishops have been calling for more migration and more welcoming on the part of Europeans, but they seem blind to the realities of the situation. Above all, they don't seem to grasp the big picture, namely that in welcoming masses of Muslim migrants, they are also welcoming the cruelties of Sharia law, the oppression of women, the end of free speech, and the persecution of Christians and Jews. So the bad news is that many in the church have become facilitators of Islam. The good news is that they can be turned around. Catholics have been subject to a disinformation campaign about Islam. Part of the disinformation comes from the media, part of it comes from liberal Catholics, and part of it comes from the stealth jihad organizations that the bishops are forever dialoguing with, organizations like the Islamic Society of North America. The antidote is to supply Catholics with solid information and solid arguments. In my own books and articles, I try to offer the counter-arguments to the stock arguments that are often made. For example, bishops in this country and in Europe like to say that Muslim migration is like any other migration. So if you oppose it, you're like the know-nothings who opposed Catholic immigrants in the 19th century, and you don't want to be like that. Well, that's not a good analogy. It's a different thing altogether. Historically, Muslims have used migration as a means of conquest. When Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina with about 100 followers, the citizens of Medina at first gave him a warm welcome. They were happy to have him, the prophet. They had heard about him. Well, how wonderful. But they were soon sorry they had invited him because he took over the city and slaughtered many of the inhabitants. He then used Medina as his base for the conquest of all of Arabia. So the migration to Medina was really the takeoff point or the breakout point for Islam. That explains why the Muslim calendar begins with the year 622, which is the year of the migration, not with the birth of Muhammad and not with his first revelation. So migration has a significance for Muslims that many Catholics fail to understand, and many other people as well. Excuse me. Failing to understand this, the bishops insist that all migration is beneficial. To cinch their case, and this is their big argument, to cinch their case, they remind us that Jesus was a migrant and a refugee. That was when the Holy Family had to flee to Egypt to escape Herod. So Jesus was a migrant and a refugee. Moreover, Pope Francis likes to say that in the face of the migrant, we can see the face of Jesus. Well, so if you close the borders, you're essentially closing the door on Jesus. Well, if you're a Christian, that's a hard argument to resist. Who wants to shut Jesus out? So, as a counter-argument, I like to point out that we're also justified in seeing the face of Muhammad in the Muslim migrant. After all, Muhammad was also a migrant and a refugee. Moreover, Muslim migrants bring with them the seeds of the faith that he founded. Moreover, as long as we're speaking of Jesus, why can't we see the face of Jesus in the victims of the Muslim refugees? Those innocents who have been beaten, raped, stabbed, and run over. So the face of Jesus is a kind of a tricky analogy. It applies to some situations but not to others. For example, do you want to say to the guy who's just been run over that it's okay because Jesus was driving the car? So it's very tricky territory. So many of the arguments that Catholics make in defense of Islam are purely emotional arguments. They're based on wishful thinking, and they're not hard to refute. Now, if there's time during the Q&A session, I can mention one of the more persuasive arguments that can be used to wake up Catholics. I call it the nuclear option, because it's kind of explosive. The crucial thing, however, is not just to offer arguments, but to help church leaders recover their memory. In the past, the church didn't proclaim its solidarity with oppressors, it fought against them. If the church is going to successfully resist Islam, it needs to recover its fighting spirit. Some examples: at the Battle of Tours in 732, the Catholic army of Charles Martel defeated a larger Muslim army and saved Europe from an Islamic invasion. In 1571, a Catholic fleet organized by the Pope defeated the larger Muslim fleet at Lepanto. By the way, none of this was done without great cost. Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, fought at the Battle of Lepanto, and he permanently lost the use of one arm, which is a problem if you're a writer. Anyways. And the other incident I want to mention, in 1683, at the Battle of Vienna, the Catholic Polish king, John Sobieski, arrived with his army in the nick of time and saved Europe one more time from an Islamic invasion. But let's fast forward to a 20th century example of Catholic resistance to tyranny, the Church's struggle against communism. And during the Cold War, under the leadership of Pope John Paul II, the Church played a major role in bringing an end to communism in Eastern Europe. In 1979, the Pope made a 9-day visit to Poland against the wishes of the Soviets. 2 million people lined the route from the airport to Warsaw. 250,000 attended the opening Mass at Victory Square. When the Pope went to the shrine at Czestochowa, a crowd of 1 million were on hand. When he celebrated Mass in Krakow, 2 to 3 million turned out. Altogether, some 12 million Poles, or 1/3 of the population of Poland, saw John Paul during this trip. And that trip marked a turning point in history. 1 year later, Lech Walesa called for a massive strike of the workers at the shipyard at Gdansk. That was the beginning of the pro-Catholic solidarity movement, and that was the beginning of the end of communism in Europe. Excuse me. Another individual who was inspired by the Pope's Polish trip was Ronald Reagan. And from the time of their first meeting, the Pope and the President became partners in a deliberate effort to bring down the Soviet Empire. Reagan wasn't a Catholic, but several of his closest advisors were, and in private with Reagan, they often spoke of the DP, the divine plan to take down communism. But without the inspiration provided by the Pope, the DP, the divine plan, might not have succeeded. And of course, he paid a heavy personal price for the role he played. 2 years after his Polish visit, John Paul II was the victim of an assassination attempt, an attempt that was ordered by Soviet Army intelligence. Not everyone at the time understood the crucial role that John Paul played in converting people away from Islam, but the Soviets certainly did understand. The point I want to make is that the Church needs to recover its fighting spirit, and it also needs to recover the intellectual acumen that allowed previous popes, priests, and lay Catholics to understand that communism was an enemy, that Nazism was an enemy, and that militant Islam was an enemy, and still is. Happily, that recovery may now be underway. Recently, Hungarian Bishop Laszlo Kisrigo said of Muslim migrants, "They are not refugees. This is an invasion. They come here with cries of Allahu Akbar. They want to take over." Very sensible bishop for a change. Now, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, has also been an outspoken critic of Muslim migration and a strong advocate for recovering Europe's Christian roots. So a Hungarian bishop and the Hungarian Prime Minister want to close the borders to an Islamic invasion. The Czech Republic and Slovakia have called for Europe to block the refugee routes. And over 1 million Poles, as I've mentioned, traveled to the Rosary at the Borders event. So something is stirring in Eastern Europe. There are numerous signs that resistance to Islam is really building. Why Eastern Europe, you may ask? Well, for two reasons. First, having recently thrown off the yoke of communism, the Eastern Europeans are not about to be subjugated by another totalitarian system. The second reason is that Catholicism, which has been in decline in Western Europe for a long time, Catholicism is still very much alive in the East. Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, for example, are Catholic majority countries. Well, Hungary is a plurality, Catholic plurality. The others are majorities. Of course, one can counter that France, Italy, and Spain are also Catholic countries, and a lot of good is done them. Well, yes, it's true, but it's more accurate to call them nominally Catholic. Church attendance is very low. The great cathedrals are largely empty, except for the tourists. If you've been to Europe, you probably noticed that. In Poland, the Catholics mass at the borders. In France, they can't be bothered to go to Mass. By the time they've gotten up and had their croissant and coffee, it's too late, we missed Mass again. And it's not just Catholics. Christianity in general has been in steep decline in Western Europe for more than half a century. And that decline paved the way for Islam. As Europeans started to lose their faith, they stopped having babies. They stopped having babies because babies get in the way of self-gratification, and also because they had nothing meaningful to pass on to the next generation. The decline of Christianity in Europe created a spiritual vacuum and a population vacuum, both of which Islam soon began to fill. So it's important to understand that the ideological struggle with Islam is in large part a spiritual struggle. It will be won by those with the deepest faith and the strongest sense of purpose. But what does the average European believe in? He believes in short work weeks, long vacations, and early retirement, all of which is very nice. But a belief in early retirement is not the kind of belief that gives one the courage to stand up to Islamists. That's where the churches come in, or ought to come in. They can provide that sense of ultimate meaning and purpose, which gives people the courage to bring children into the world, to stand up for freedom, and to resist tyranny. The church was once a bulwark against Islam, and it can be today. The church doesn't command armies anymore, but then much of the battle that needs to be fought now has to be fought on the intellectual, informational, and spiritual level. The church is a sleeping giant in regard to Islam. If it can be reawakened, it will be a powerful force of resistance. Perhaps the first step toward that goal is for church leaders to drop the silly notion that all religions are equally wonderful, and replace it with the clear-eyed view that Catholics of an earlier generation took when faced with an enemy ideology. That clear-eyed view can also be found in the Gospels. When Jesus sent his disciples out into the world, he cautioned them to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Our current leaders have shown that they can be as innocent as doves. Now it's time for them to show that they can be as wise as serpents. Thank you.
Well, a very short introduction. For me, my claim to fame essentially is that 3.5 years ago, the Council on American Islamic Relations honored me by listing me as one of the leading Islamophobes in the country. Okay, with that, I would like to begin. And has everybody here, or did everybody here, attend the lecture yesterday by Katie Hopkins? Okay, marvelous, marvelous lecture. She described the impending destruction of Great Britain through the Islamification of Great Britain, and she did it in a very witty way. However, the topic is deadly serious, and she urged us, if you remember, this was the title of her talk, to get furious and fight back. Is anyone here furious? Yes. Good, good. Okay, then I don't have to rouse you to fury and fighting back, but I would like to devote the next few minutes to giving you some hints as how better to do that, how better to fight back. Now, the conservative movement is essentially split on defining the enemy. And because we are split, we are ineffective, and it's very difficult then to win the war if we are not united. And what I mean by this is that many people, and this includes many people here at the Restoration Weekend, including many speakers, believe that our enemy is radical Islam. And I'd like to discuss that for a moment. Clarion organization, which I'm sure you're familiar with, always talks about radical Islam. And we've heard the expression radical Islamic terrorism. That is a nonsense expression, because when you put an adjective like that in front of it, radical Islamic terrorism, it implies that there's such a thing as a non-radical Islamic terrorism. That doesn't make any sense. So we need to start calling the baby by its name. What is our enemy? Who is our enemy? And how do we fight it? Well, if it's not radical Islam, let me tell you for a moment why it's not radical Islam. The president of Turkey, Erdogan, has famously said that moderate Islam is an ugly term, and that there is no such thing as moderate or immoderate Islam, that Islam is Islam, and that's it. We have also heard here some people say that, well, radical Islam is the problem, and moderate Islam is the solution. But according to Erdogan, radical Islam does not exist, and moderate Islam does not exist. And so if it doesn't exist, it can't be the problem, radical Islam, and if moderate Islam doesn't exist, it can't be the solution. So where are we going with all of this? The problem is that it is Islam itself that is the problem, and we have to have the courage to say so. Because the longer we say that, thank you. The longer we talk about radical Islam, we are in fact leaving out the major threats that Islam presents to our civilization. If we don't talk about Islam, there's no justification, for example, for stopping Muslim immigration. Why should we do it if it's not just to stop a few terrorists? The situation is much more serious than that. And in fact, by talking about radical Islam, we tend to devote our attention primarily to the terrorists. The Muslim terrorists, obviously, the Islamic terrorists. But by doing that, we take our attention away, in fact, from the real existential threats that we face from Islam. And so, the major existential threat is, of course, the stealth jihad. It's going on right under our noses, so to say. It's sort of like termites invading a building. You may see a couple of termite tracks on the bottom, but unless you know what you're looking for, you have no idea what's going on behind the walls. And one of these days, the building is going to collapse if you don't take measures. Now, so who are we at war with? Well, it's not radical Islam. We are at war with Islam, Islam itself. Islam has been at war with us for 1,400 years, and I say we are at war with Islam. We should be at war with Islam, but most people are not, and not even in the conservative movement are we all agreed that this is our enemy. What's the consequences of not being at war with Islam? Well, then there's no justification for banning Muslim immigration. After all, Muslim immigrants are raised in a society, and we can see what their society is like, where they're coming from. They're bringing that with them. They're bringing with them the ideology of Islam that they were raised with. I don't think we want that here. Clearly the values that they were raised with, and this doesn't mean 100% of them, but certainly the majority, they're raised with the values of Islam, which in many, many ways contradict our values as expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all of our Western civilization. By focusing on radical Islam, we also leave out the major source of the Islamic threats, and that, of course, is the mosques and the community organizations. That's where this ideology is being propagated. Another reason why we need to focus on Islam and not radical Islam is Muslim candidates for political office. They're the smoothest, sweet-talking people. They're dressed nicely. They're very pleasant, and they always say that they're just as American as everybody else. However, if you look at their backgrounds, you will see that they are practically all graduates of the Muslim Student Association in college, and then they go on through the Council on American-Islamic Relations, which, as you know, of course, is a Hamas-linked terrorist organization, Muslim terrorist organization, and Hamas itself is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it all ties in, and the Muslim candidates are all tied in with this. Whatever you do, you must try to prevent these people from getting elected. But you can't do that if you're only talking about radical Islam, because they present themselves as peaceful. And so there's no way of knowing that, in fact, they are supporters of this radical ideology. Another reason, if we talk only about radical Islam, we neglect what's going on in the schools, which, of course, in their textbooks and teaching materials are portraying Islam as a religion of peace, which, as you know, it's not. Another one, the hijab. The hijab is being presented to us by these Muslim supremacists as simply an article of clothing and modesty. Well, actually, it's not modesty. If you read the verse in the Quran that essentially prescribes a hijab, you will see that the purpose is not modesty. The purpose is to protect them from Muslim men so that they won't be molested, as the Quran says. Also, wearing the hijab is a symbol of submission to Sharia law. And they will actually say, though, if you read Muslim newspapers, and I've seen that before, that they say also that the hijab is not a question of modesty, it's certainly not a question of fashion, it is a question of doing what Allah wants women to do. Another example here is that the Islamic Republic of Iran, which nobody refers to these days as the Islamic Republic of Iran, but I would like all of you in the future to refer to the country as the Islamic Republic of Iran, because if you refer to it only as Iran, you see it as just another nation state, but it's not. It is a revolutionary state whose purpose is to spread Islam to the entire world. Their Constitution, and you can Google that, Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, in the preamble, it says definitely and specifically that they are going to use their armed forces not only for defense, but for fulfilling their ideological mission in God's way, jihad, namely jihad by spreading Islam to the rest of the world. So in their own constitution, they are telling us they're going to commit military aggression against the rest of the world in order to spread Islam, because it's an Islamic state. Please use the term Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, there are some people in our movement who think that we are faced with the challenge of modernizing Islam. Let me tell you, we are not faced with the challenge of modernizing Islam. We are faced with the incoherence of trying to modernize Islam. Islam cannot be modernized. And the reason it cannot be modernized goes back to the basic proposition of Islam itself, which is that the Quran is considered by all Muslims to be the literal word of their God. No human being is going to contest the literal word of his God. If you think of our Bible, we have the Ten Commandments and we have the rest of the Bible, and they're different. We can talk about the rest of the Bible, but I don't think you find many people saying that, well, we really ought to revise the Ten Commandments. Doesn't mean that people follow them, but obviously no one is talking about revising them, because that's the literal word of God if you're religious. And in Islam, every word in the Quran is the literal word of their God, and it cannot be revised. No human being can ever do that. In fact, it's forbidden by Sharia law, and anybody who tries it is subject to the death penalty in Sharia law. Well, the very notion of reform means violating the sacredness of the Quran, and therefore it cannot be done. There are Muslims, of course, who claim that they want to reform Islam, but if you look closely, you will see that they never criticize the Quran. Of course, the Quran is where the whole problem with Islam is. And if you can't criticize the Quran and get rid of parts of it, obviously you can't, then there's no way to reform Islam. And all of these so-called moderate Muslims are simply trying to fool us and to fool themselves, because they're essentially Westerners. They have adopted Western values, but for whatever reason, they continue to identify themselves as Muslims. And there's a conflict. They are suffering from a conflict between their conscience and their faith. I don't really envy them, but we should not pay any attention to them because the Muslim community doesn't pay any attention to them. They have no influence in the Muslim community, and we have no business supporting them, and we have no business promoting the notion that Islam can be reformed. It cannot be reformed because Islam, what is Islam? Islam is the Quran plus the sayings of Muhammad, the Hadith, the Sunnah. Those are fixed texts. They don't come in different versions. There's no such thing as a modern version of Islam as opposed to an old version of Islam, because the Quran does not come in different versions, and Muhammad's Sunnah does not come in different versions. And both of them are required for being a faithful Muslim. Another reason, the word Islam itself means, of course, as you know, submission. Any Muslim who thinks of reforming Islam is automatically violating the very definition of the word. If you submit and you follow it. You don't contest it and you don't reform it. Does that make sense? Right? So let's not be misled by these so-called reformers. So the essence of Islam, then, we have to remember, is that it is a complete way of life. And by the way, everything I'm giving you here comes from the Islamic texts and from the Islamic religious authorities. You have my email address at the bottom of the handout that you have on the actions to take. I'll be happy to send you a collection of excerpts from the Quran and from the Sunnah and from Muslim religious authorities, which you can then use when talking to other people to explain the truth about Islam. Thank you. Please, whenever you do talk to other people about Islam, always quote the Islamic texts and the Islamic religious authorities. Don't do it in your own name, because they'll say, well, what right do you have to say this about Islam? Well, you don't, and neither do I, but the Islamic religious authorities do. And put the onus on them, that is, on the religious authorities and on the text, so that if people don't like what they hear, let them go argue with the Islamic religious authorities, not with you. And they tell us that Islam is fundamentally different from all other religions. Not a religion like Western religion, because Western religion is essentially a matter between the believer and God. In Islam, they talk about Islam as being a complete way of life and a complete code of life, which means that it is totalitarian. And if you look at the passages in the Quran and Muhammad, they tell us plainly that the goal of Islam is to rule the world, to set up a worldwide caliphate under Sharia law. Well, that's imperialist. And so what we have here is an ideology, and by the way, I didn't make up the word ideology to apply to Islam. They do it. The Islamic religious authorities tell us that it is an ideology, and they say, for example, that it is a comprehensive ideology which covers everything. Well, comprehensive, complete, total, it means the same thing. It's a totalitarian ideology and an imperialist ideology, something like communism and something like Nazism and fascism. Please keep that in mind, and there are certain logical consequences of this. If Islam is not a religion like other religions because it is a totalitarian and imperialist ideology, then what is a mosque? Well, a mosque is not just a house of prayer like other religions either then. So what is it? In the words of the Islamic religious authorities, a mosque is the propagation center for the ideology. Keep that in mind next time you pass by a mosque. And by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood, which we've heard something about in the last couple of days, because they organize this major threat that we're going to talk about in a second, the Muslim Brotherhood says in their own documents that the mosques and the Islamic centers are the organizational centers for the Islamic community to promote Islam and the triumph of Islam. Now, what are the threats then from Islam? There are three major existential threats, and ISIS is not one of them. Neither is Al-Qaeda. 9/11 was not an existential threat to the United States. It was a horrible atrocity, 3,000 people murdered, but we did not go under because of that. In fact, the country became stronger. Far more, many, many times more people are killed per year in the various cities around the United States, and auto accidents, whatnot. And so when we see Muslim terror acts, they, by numbers, pale in comparison to the other violent deaths that our country experiences. So what are the three major threats, existential threats from Islam? First one is the Islamic Republic of Iran. If they ever get nuclear weapons, they have already promised to, as I mentioned, to spread Islam throughout the world through military aggression. They will use the military weapons, atomic weapons, and it says so in their constitution also. They quote a verse from the Quran which says that use all weapons that you can get in order to terrify the enemy. And so there's nothing restricting them from using nuclear weapons. They have tried to get it, they are trying to get it, and they will get it unless we stop them. The second major threat from Islam, the existential threat, is Muslim immigration. You change the population. Gaddafi from Egypt, from Libya, once said that the Muslims are going to conquer Europe without firing a shot. And he's right. There are over 50 million Muslims in Europe. They reproduce far faster than the native European population, and more of them are being brought in. So you change the population. And not only is the population by itself, the numbers, significant, but the fact, as Dr. Kirkland has also mentioned, the Muslim population is enabled by large portions of our population. Certainly, everybody who voted for Hillary, for example, is an enabler of Muslim supremacy in the United States because they never criticize Islam. And so it's not just that the Muslims are 1% of our population. In fact, their power and their influence is far greater than would be expected from the 1%. And that is because they are enabled, and as Robert Spencer also pointed out, by the university administrators all over the country. Also by our Christian and Jewish clergy. Part of the Muslim Brotherhood program relies on so-called interfaith events. And they're all the same, these interfaith events. You have a Christian pastor or Catholic priest on one side, then a rabbi in the middle, and then you have an imam or some other representative of the Muslim community on the other end. And the Christian always starts out by apologizing for the Crusades and the Inquisition. The rabbi then apologizes for something the Hebrews did 3,000 years ago to somebody's olive trees. I actually heard that. The Muslim never, ever apologizes about anything, ever. And so this is what happens, and that the Christian and Jewish clergy then promote this, and they promote to their congregations that Islam is basically a religion of peace. So, in other words, the Muslim Brotherhood is using the hands of the non-Muslims to destroy our civilization, just like its program said. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that, the Muslim Brotherhood program. If not, again, send me an email. I'll send you all of these quotations from the Islamic sources, and what it says, that they will use the hands of the non-Muslims. For example, the 2 Muslim congressmen that we have, do you think they were elected by Muslims? No, they were elected by non-Muslims. The Muslim population is so small they don't have any electoral influence. And so they rely on the hands of the non-Muslims. Muslim immigration, then, is a major threat because they will out-reproduce us, and they themselves are increasing their population percentage, and they form separate communities. It is forbidden by Islam to assimilate. And by the way, immigration without assimilation is invasion. Remember that. So it's just what's happening in Europe, just what's happening here. So immigration without assimilation is, thank you, invasion. We are being invaded. It's a peaceful invasion, just like Gaddafi said was happening in Europe. The third, and perhaps the most important, existential threat from Islam is the so-called stealth jihad. You're all familiar with that. Robert Spencer wrote a book on that several years ago. There's been much more information on that since then. I urge you to familiarize yourself with the stealth jihad. What is the stealth jihad? Well, this is subversion of all of our institutions, our schools, our universities, our mass media, and the government institutions all the way from dog catcher to the White House. Now, what can we do about this? We have to do 2 major take two major actions, and you all have the sheet in front of you, actions that you can take. We should focus all of our efforts on achieving two goals. One is to declare the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. If we don't do that, there's nothing else that we can do. Thank you. So that's first and foremost, we must get the Muslim Brotherhood under control, and not just the Muslim Brotherhood per se, but all of its front groups like the Council on American-Islamic Relations and a whole alphabet soup of other Muslim organizations in the United States. And the second goal that we need to focus on is somehow restricting or prohibiting Muslim immigration to the United States. These are the two goals that we must achieve in order to preserve our civilization. There's no other way. Now, how do we do that? Well, there's a number of actions that you can take, and I hope you do. Let's go through a couple of them. First of all,
we've got a couple minutes left here.
Okay. So if the Republican Party does not save us, nobody will. Therefore, you must work through the Republican Party and try to influence them and educate them to show them that Islam is the enemy. I know it's too controversial to say that openly, but do what you can. Go to Republican Party meetings, raise the issue of Islam. Get them to talk about it. Stimulate a discussion of Islam wherever you are. We don't have time to go through all of these other things that you can do, but we need your help. If you just go home and don't do anything, we're going to lose. It's not sufficient simply to contribute money to other people who are doing things. We need you to actually do something. You have spheres of influence. Please use them in every possible way to stimulate a discussion about Islam itself. Now, then in conclusion, since we don't have time to go through all of these others, then again, without a unified focus on Islam as the enemy, we cannot achieve the goals of stopping Muslim immigration or declaring the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, because in the United States, the Muslim Brotherhood masquerades as peaceful. They don't tell you what their real goals are, except you can look in their documents and find out. So if we do not achieve these two goals, we can't win. You need to help us win. Please help preserve our country for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. Again, not only with your financial support, but also with your actions. Please do something. As Katie Hopkins said, get furious and fight back. You need to fight back. Thank you.